Hey everyone, did you know that medicine is racist?
Modern healthcare was built using black bodies without our consent.
I'm Rich Lowry of National Review, and that was Congresswoman Summer Lee from Pennsylvania at a hearing the other day in the House over DEI practices at medical schools. And guess what? She's in favor of them. So, one thing you can take away from this hearing is woke zaniness is not going away anytime soon. But I think her riff is worth dwelling on because there was a lot of nonsense in it that she repeated with great confidence and that we hear very often in the debate and is credited by people who should know better. Here's a little bit more from her.
I don't know if some of my colleagues know some of the history of black care and mistreatment in the medical field. But for instance, gynecology procedures were developed from unanesthetized, non-consensual experiments performed on enslaved black women.
All right, so she's not totally out of line there. She's talking about someone named J. Marion Sims, long considered the father of gynecology. He was in Alabama, and he did perform experimental surgeries on enslaved women. He was doing what's called fistula repairs. I'm not going to get into this in detail. We don't need to do this on this video. Suffice it to say, this is a pretty devastating medical condition that he was trying to fix. Now, he says that these women consented to these procedures. They were enslaved, though, so that raises questions about how can they consent, how real is the consent, although you would think someone would want this condition repaired. Also, as the Congresswoman referred to, he did not use anesthesia. He started these procedures in the 1840s. Anesthesia is developed and demonstrated as a success. Ether anesthesia about 1846. Even when that happens, he's still not giving them anesthesia. Now, he says the procedure is not painful enough to require anesthesia. One, obviously very easy for him to say. Two, this also may have been based on the racist idea that black people didn't feel pain the same way that white people do. Anyway, he does actually come up with a procedure that works. He goes on to move to New York City, starts a women's hospital, and treats black and white, primarily free, black women at this clinic. So if you want to say this work is problematic, that's not a problem. But the Congresswoman is obviously giving us a stilted version of this, and then there's more from her.
Life-saving vaccines were developed using stolen cells from Henrietta Lacks, a non-consenting black woman. Modern health care was built using black bodies without our consent.
So she's referring to a real thing here as well. She's referring to a woman named Henrietta Lacks. She had cervical cancer as a young woman, aged about 31, I believe. She was treated at Johns Hopkins Hospital in 1951, and they took healthy tissue and cancer cells from her, which was a typical practice at the time, and they'd use people's tissue to do research, and it emerged that the cancer cells just replicated themselves basically forever. So these cells turned out to be incredibly important to medical research. It is true, major vaccines were developed from them. They're still being used today. Now, she was totally unaware of it. It's not as though any actual harm was done to her through this practice. And again, it was a kind of standard operating procedure at the time. Today, she would know, her family would know. Her family bizarrely didn't learn about this until years and years afterwards. But it's not as though this was something that was an example of racist exploitation. Now, even if you take the dimmest view of J. Marion Sims or how Henrietta Lacks was treated, that doesn't mean, as we heard from the Congresswoman at the beginning of this video, that modern medicine is based on racism or the exploitation of black people. Just think about it. It begins modern medicine really in the 18th and 19th century with the advent of methods of observation and experimentation. We get vaccinations successfully for the first time, 1796, anesthesia, which I mentioned in 1846. Then you get germ theory. Then you get antiseptic surgery. Then you get medical imaging. Then you get antibiotics. Then you get biomedical research that's done so much to define our age. And all this is the work of millions of theorists and researchers and doctors. So to say it all depends on a foundation of racism is obviously absurd. And they're not black or white medical practices or cures for disease. They're just medical practices and cures for disease, but that's not the way the Congresswoman looks at it.
Let me just say, I have a black doctor and I sought my black doctor out. In fact, black doctors are in high demand because black patients know that culturally competent care can be the difference between care and cure or life and death.
Now, what she's talking about there is the concept of racial concordance, the idea that having a doctor of the same ethnicity or the same race is going to create a better connection, more communication, better cooperative relationship, and therefore you're going to get a better result. Now, she obviously believes this. She's talking about it with great passion, I assume great sincerity, but there's just no evidence for it whatsoever. Now, there was a study several years ago that got a lot of attention that suggested that Black newborns did better under the care of Black doctors, but the study turns out to have been deeply flawed. Now, as can very often happen with these kind of studies, the initial researchers did not account for all the confounding variables. Other researchers went back, took a look, and found this key flaw. They published a version of their research in the City Journal. Quoting from their key finding here, controlling for very low birth weight, i.e. comparing newborns within the same weight class, eliminates the racial concordance result in the most detailed statistical models. This happens because Black doctors disproportionately care for Black newborns with healthy birth weights. Conversely, white doctors care for a disproportionately large share of the Black babies most at risk, those who have a very low birth weight. There's more on this from a big report from an outfit that's anti-DEI in medicine called Do No Harm. The evidence available in medical research literature does not support the efficacy of racial concordance. 4 of 5 available systematic reviews, including the most recent systematic review from 2023, show no improvement in outcomes when patients are matched to physicians who share their racial or ethnic identity. The 5th review featured glaring methodological problems. Now, the Congresswoman also poured scorn on the idea of objective standards in medicine. She criticized Republicans for advancing this notion.
You cannot standardize test your way into empathy or taking people's pain seriously or cultural competency. MCAT scores don't translate to better care for Black people automatically. Having all white male doctors is just as bad for the medical profession as having all white male congressmen is to our government.
Certainly getting a high MCAT score doesn't guarantee you're a wonderful person or you're going to go on to be a great doctor, but it is indicative of how well you're going to do in medical school, which logically is going to have some connection to the kind of doctor you become. Again, let's look at the research. Here's a recent journal article. Forgive me, there's going to be a little jargon here. Researchers reported medium to large correlations between MCAT total scores and medical student outcomes. Correlations between total undergraduate grade point averages and medical student outcomes were similar, but slightly lower. When MCAT scores and grade point averages were used together, they predicted student performance and progress better than either alone. Despite differences in average MCAT scores and grade point averages between students who self-identified as white or Asian and those from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, predictive validity results were comparable. The same was true for students from different socioeconomic backgrounds and for males and females. In other words, MCATs, grade point averages, predict how well you're going to do in medical school, regardless of your race or your gender. And by the way, despite what the Congresswoman says, most people, they just want good, experienced, talented doctors, no matter what their race, no matter what their gender. And this too is supported by the research. This is a survey finding from an outfit called Ingram Market Research. Quoting here, many advocacy groups have pushed racial concordance, there's that term again, where medical professionals and their patients share a racial identity as a top priority for medical professionals. But Black adults overwhelmingly say they care more about medical professionals' competence than their races. More than 88% of Black adults say it matters more to them that a medical professional is highly competent than whether they look like them. In short, all of this is out of touch with factual reality, out of touch with the way most people look at the world. Good medicine is good medicine. End of story. Hey, by the way, do yourself a favor, comment, like, or subscribe. I promise you won't regret it. I'm Rich Lowry, over and out.